welcome back. Good to see you. It's been a minute. We're here. Kevin and I are here with is this our 12th discussion of the Road to Serfdom?
Yes, episode 12.
Episode 12. I guess it's 12. Yeah, it is 12.
It's 12 total. That includes the intro and the live stream we did.
Yeah, so we're on our A game already.
There we go. Yeah, we're actually recording this at 11 in the morning, so start early or don't start at all, right?
That's right.
To be fair, it is a Tuesday.
Yeah, that's right. 11 your time, 10 my time. So it's been a while, so let's just talk about like kind of what this chapter is, why it took so long for us to get this out, and honestly, we apologize that it took us this long. We appreciate your patience. So much of this has been like, I'm not sure that there's been a chapter or anything that we've put more time and discussion and research into, like, by far. I mean, can you,
yeah,
I don't even know what would be second. Like this, it feels like we put more time and work into this one, which I'm not teeing this up to say it's going to be amazing, that it's going to like pan out into something super awesome. But I'm just saying that we have, like, it feels like more than like sometimes maybe like 2 or 3 of these combined, honestly. It feels like, for me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
For sure. We can normally gauge how much content we have to go over because we share a document here that we both have notes on, so we can kind of order our thoughts. And we gauge at about 7 pages of notes per episode is normally good for a 2-hour episode. And in total, we're not reading all these notes. In total, we have like 18 pages on this one.
Yeah.
So most of that we won't be going through today, but it is a way to organize our thoughts just on how relatable these 2 chapters are. Because one of the reasons that we've had to delay it for so long is the plan was to just go over chapter 12, and then we both went into 13 a little bit, and we're like, wow, this is directly relatable. And I think the best way to do it justice is to combine it as one episode and try to help the listener understand a lot of the background knowledge to this, because a lot of the stuff, another big reason why we had to delay it was just how humble we were before, not understanding what seems to be like basic history that we should all know. But we understand history, and by understand I use that word very loosely here.
Totally.
We understand history like back to World War II, and normally around the end of it, right? At least I can speak for the Americans. All we know is America went in, kicked ass, and we won World War II, and that's just how it ended. And we kind of know the stuff that happened after that. And all the angry letters from the Europeans and Canadians or whatever, he'd send it to Truman's email address.
Yes, please.
But we knew nothing really before World War II. I knew kind of the basics of World War I, and this chapter kind of required that a little bit. I mean, he gave enough context to help the reader understand. So I'm not saying you have to be a history buff to read this book, but it certainly helps understand that background context to understand the trajectory of Germany, the trajectory of Britain, and now the trajectory of the United States. So a lot of that was just being humble and being like, you came to me the first day we planned on getting together on Zoom and reviewing notes, and you said right away, it's like, do you feel prepared for this? Because I don't know anything about World War One. I'm the same way. I know very little about it. And so we both had to kind of take our own version of a history class and go over it. And it was really cool seeing what we are learning, what we got to learn, even the stuff that's probably not going to even make it into this episode. I got to learn a lot of interesting history about Europe before, or I would say in the 19th century, in which, I told you a lot of the stuff that surprised me about how long, how recently they were fighting over stuff, how recently a lot of these places did stuff like abolish slavery compared to the United States. Even though I'm told in the United States that we, held slaves the longest, and America invented slavery. So, that's why it's America's original sin. And you dive just a little deep into history, and you're like, oh, that's not true at all.
Yeah. And I mean, it just kind of, one, I'll say, for anyone who does want to learn more about World War I, Kansas City, I believe, has the only World War I museum in the country, and it's amazing. You should go there. My brother told me that they have a VR experience right now where you wear like a headset and you're like in a dirigible and you're in the trenches and stuff. So that's really good. I think in the movie 1918 is about World War I, and it's in the trenches. That's a fantastic film. But yeah, it really exposes the history, the gap that we have. So like we learn about the founding of the country and then there's kind of a some things, Lewis and Clark, and then it's the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, and then Jim Crow. And that's like what we learned. And it, like, we skip all this stuff. I mean, we even talked about that in a video a year and a half ago about the hierarchy stuff, where I'm like, we didn't learn anything about the Reconstruction the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction South, and we don't learn anything about World War I or the geopolitics of the stuff that led up to that, the unification of Germany and all this other, like, there's just so much stuff we don't learn about. So yeah, it was really humbling, but it was good. Like, it was really good. So yeah. Anyway, that being said, that's what we did. And I'll get into kind of the structure of what this one's going to be like, because it not only did it require so much more time and research and attention, but we haven't structured an episode like this before. It's something that, I mean, it just kind of made sense for this. It didn't make it more fun to do, but it just kind of made sense. And it's really stressful, but hopefully it works out. But before we get into that, let's get into a summary of the way back, the long ago, of our last conversation, of the last one we did, which, by the way, our last chapter review, I thought that was going to be like the big hard one. I'm like, okay, we really got to do this one justice. And it was a great conversation, but I thought it was going to be smooth sailing after that. And then that was not the case. But anyway, so why don't you, Kevin, give the folks at home a review of our last chapter 11.
Yep. I was actually just about to say the same thing, that I thought this was going to be the toughest monster to tackle. And then we went into this, and I'm not excited to start reviewing chapter 14 and 15, because it just keeps getting worse. And by worse, I mean better, more interesting, but harder to dive into. So the last chapter we went through is chapter 11, which is the end of truth. I love the way he structured the chapter. But for any of us who listened to this chapter or listen to us review this chapter, a suggestion that I would make is, if you find this to be interesting, read The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. It's basically this chapter expounded in its own book, and it's pretty fascinating to understand the dynamics of truth, power, and just how to create a mass movement based on this stuff. But one of the first things that we highlighted from the chapter is that competing propaganda is not the same as hegemonic propaganda. It's not just about being lied to. When you hear the word propaganda, that just seems like, oh, it's just a bunch of very, very sneaky lies. That's not it. That's not, at least not completely it. A good propagandist is also able to isolate the people from the truth. That's so good. And because the truth is the only thing that can defend the person against the propaganda, the same way that liberalism appears to be the only thing that can defend the individual from the authoritarian. And that is why they try to block that out. That's why they try to label that evil. They label truth as evil, or they don't even allow you to see the truth, right? Think of North Korea just putting up a wall and not allowing anyone to see the outside.
As you were saying that. It's like censorship always is it's like the Silver Surfer and Galactus, to get nerdy there. Like, censorship is the herald of authoritarianism, like, period.
Yep. And I mean, there's a bunch of contemporary stuff we can go through on the censorship part, but maybe we'll get into that later. The second thing we highlighted is the new moral code must be established in the totalitarian regime, but the new moral code and the new moral standards must appeal to us. You can't just build a new moral code or moral standard from the ground up and expect people to buy it wholesale. You have to be able to do it in a way that you can make them believe that this standard is actually something they held the whole time. It's something they always believed in. They have to tell, especially, use the example of us in America, something we'll get to again later. You have to tell them that we were never a capitalist society. The capital was always bad. We always wanted to tear down the big rich guys and try to compile our power as a collective via the state. That's just a moral we've always held, which is something that's actually very, very old, but certainly not American. So that is something you have to do that. And really the only way you can do that, you have to do revisionist history, which is another form of not telling the truth. It's another form of a lie. And we see that a bunch today because, you're destructive of all morals, and they undermine one of the foundations of all morals, which is the sense of and respect for truth. A direct quote from the last chapter. Third thing we highlighted is our systems of information must be corrupted to silence dissent. So we just talked about it here. Censorship is the best way to silence dissent, even if it's on stuff that that I'm thinking of different things that you can say that's against the CDC right now, stuff that they've said before. It's considered dissent if you quote the CDC from 5 months ago. And it's something that must be silenced because you're kind of showing ignorance right there. You're saying, okay, these people bounced all over the place. You can't expect us to be able to tell the truth in that fashion, because then they're going to know that there's a weakness there, and that maybe they're not the best leaders. And the last one is the foundations like science, history, law, and education must be redirected to serve the purposes of the plan. We see this a lot in this chapter. I have a note here that's saying they're all German cats, which is a Curtis Yarvin idea of, in Germany, they had, real quick, a guy subscribed to a cat magazine, as everyone does, I'm sure. In Nazi Germany, and originally the cat magazine was just about cats, and by a couple of years later, during the war, with the German propaganda, it's all about the German cat, right? So he says German cats. Yarvin makes the example of I can't read the food section of the New York Times without being socialist food and saying, okay, it's just a German cat. But this is another way to kind of disguise the untruth we find, is be able to redirect everything. Certainly something we saw in Nazi Germany, to redirect everything and rebrand it as this has got to be our version of the thing, and the opposite version of this thing is then evil and something we need to fight against. And that's how you create an outgroup.
Yeah, so that last one's a great segue into this chapter. And that last chapter, man, even just going back through that summary, I just remember like what an amazing Jiminy Christmas. Yeah, what a good discussion that was, and what a good chapter that is. So, but like what Kevin said there is that things like history, science, law, everything must be redirected to serve the purpose of the plan. And we'll get into that. There are a lot of examples of that in this discussion. But so chapter 12 is called The Socialist Roots of Nazism. And chapter 13 is called The Totalitarians Among Us. And these are both kind of like a synthesis, like together, of one of the main points that Hayek makes. I believe he makes it in chapter 3, when he talks about how like collectivism, like is, if you think about collectivism as this one thing, yeah, so totalitarians in our midst, not among us. Yeah. Thank you. That collectivism is a thing. It's I think he says it's, I don't remember what is it, genus, order, species, I don't know, whatever. But his point is
species of collectivism. Okay,
yeah. So all of so collectivism as whatever type of thing, whatever is above species, like Nazism is just one offshoot of collectivism. Fascism is an offshoot of collectivism. Communism is an offshoot of collectivism. And his point is that whatever is true of collectivism is true of all of these things. And collectivism always leads to authoritarianism. And so why he takes great pains, and even just one of the questions we asked is, like, we've mentioned this in almost every chapter, I think, is where Hayek discusses, like, this isn't a uniquely German thing. This isn't a uniquely German thing. This isn't just not like something unique to the Nazis. So then why does he dedicate an entire chapter called The Socialist Roots of Nazism? And I think it's because he wanted to like make the point to people, like, as much as he could. And I'll get into a quote that really sums this up really well, that you can't take for granted that what's happening in Germany is a uniquely German thing. Socialism, which is what a lot of people were arguing for, and planning is basically socialism. And we'll get into the definition of that here in a minute. Nazism is rooted in the ideas of socialism and planning. And so, and just because Nazism is one particular part, like totalitarian end, and again, like fascism or like communism or whatever you want to call it, like that road of collectivism leads to something like that inevitably. And so he wanted people to realize good and hard that the ideas they were advocating for weren't just loosely connected to Nazism and what they were fighting, but they were at the root, they were at the core, they were actually essential to Nazism. You could not separate Nazism from these collectivist ideas. And so what he does, and before I get into that, let's get into some definitions. Planning is basically top-down bureaucratic organization of society, right? You plan out everything. You don't leave anything to chance. The top directs everything, allocation of resources, and it's price controls everything. like that, but it's just big bureaucracy that runs everything. It's the opposite of a free society, even though it might not seem like that at first. But planning, just like, I think planning and socialism are interchangeable. I mean, you can tell me if you agree or disagree. Planning is just like diet socialism, and then it has to lead to full bore, and then socialism leads to some form of authoritarianism. But anyway, and then liberalism,
because
we're going to talk a lot.
Planning.
Go for it.
Before you go from planning, I think what we've kind of learned. So planning is the term of the day in Hayek's time, writing this 1944 Britain. Today, honestly, I think, well, let's jump back. I think we saw from the context he gave about Germany that the word wasn't planning, it was organization. This is what they wanted to use. So organization was their buzzword for socialism. Planning was Britain's buzzword for socialism. Honestly, today, I think in America, as sad as it is to say, I think democracy is, or democratic is their version of socialism, because they just want to bring it by democratic means. So they bastardize the word, as they do with many words, as the word you're about to get to right now. Democracy is unfortunately their avenue into planning, because they say democratize, meaning give the state all the power, and we'll just let you people vote on how we should shift power. But it never works out that way, does it?
No, and I think that's an excellent point, Kevin. And in fact, speaking of Yarvin, he makes that same point where he's like, okay, if we say we're going to politicize something, that's considered bad. But if we say we're going to democratize it, that's considered good, even though they basically mean the same thing in practice. And so he's like, you need to think about why one of those is considered good and one of them is considered bad, if they mean the same thing. And I think you're right. Yeah, democracy or just democratic socialism is what they'll argue for here. But no, you're totally right. And liberalism, because we're going to talk a lot about what is the liberal or what is liberalism. In this context, it's that classical liberalism. It means like openness to ideas. It's free exchange of ideas, free thought. The best contemporary analog, I think, is probably libertarian, like philosophy. I'm not talking about philosophy of government. It's just like general philosophy of being. And so like the libertarian or like more conservative philosophy of being or doing things. And so that's what liberalism is. And that's really important. You guys understand this is not our contemporary. It's just think of the exact opposite of our contemporary, how we use the word liberal. And that's what we're talking about here. But anyway, so I'll queue up or give you guys a quote, and then we're going to get into, all of this. There's a lot here. Kevin's going to give us a history lesson, but I just kind of want to give. That's right. Yeah, buckle up, guys. But so I put together a few quotes from Hayek here that I think sums up what he was doing there and what we are doing here. So, like, here's this quote, and basically what Hayek is trying to make people realize in Great Britain and what he's doing. We are trying to do the same thing. So we're going to give some contemporary analogs for some of these things. So there's I'll just read the quote first. It is not the present Germany, but the Germany of 20 or 30 years ago, to which conditions in this country, he's talking about Great Britain, show an ever increasing resemblance. I wish I could, in a few paragraphs, adequately convey the alarming impression gained from the perusal of a few of the English works on the ideas dominating the Germany of the last war, where almost every word could be applied to the views most conspicuous in current English literature. So what he's saying, so I'm just going to interrupt myself here. What he's saying is we need to look at how similar Great Britain of today is, and today being his time when he was writing, is to not the Germany of right now, because that's not how that works. You have to look at what led to the Germany of Hayek's time. And he's saying, look at the similarities between the arguments and the policies and the zeitgeist, that's spirit of the times or whatever, in Germany 20 or 30 years ago and in Great Britain today. He's like, it's word for word. It's the same arguments. It's the same ideas. And so we need to be very concerned with what led to Nazism. And if we are concerned, then we need to look at what led to Nazism specifically. So an example he gives is he says, any attempt to restore traditional Britain is opposed by a scheme which not only in general outline, but also in detail and even wording is indistinguishable from the socialist dreams which dominated German discussion 25 years ago. He's saying we are identical to what they were saying. Not only demands like those of the resolution adopted on Professor Lasky's motion, which requires the retention in peacetime, the measures of government control needed for mobilizing the national resources in war, but all of the characteristic catchwords, such as the balanced economy, which Professor Lasky now demands for Great Britain, or the community consumption towards which production is to be centrally directed, are bodily taken over from the German ideology. He's saying, so Lasky is the guy that Hayek loves to beat up on because he's one of the idiots who are arguing this stuff, but he's saying they're making the same arguments that Germany was making during and after World War I. And he says the similarities are even more one of the temper or the attitude with which the problems are approached than the specific arguments used. So he's saying not only is it word for word, but it's also the attitudes and the emotions behind it. He says a similar readiness to break all cultural ties with the past and to stake everything on the success of a particular experiment. As was also true in Germany, most of the works which are preparing the way for a totalitarian course in this country are the product of sincere ideals and often men of considerable intellectual distinction. So what Hayek, again to summarize, Hayek is saying the wording, the attitudes, everything was like that we're seeing in Great Britain today, because people were calling him alarmist. They were saying, we're not Nazis. There's nothing like, it's nothing similar between us and the Third Reich. How could you say that? And he's saying, no. It's the Germany of 20 or 30 years ago that it's word for word, and not just word for word, but spirit for spirit, emotion for emotion. This reckless abandonment of everything that led to progress and trying to stake everything on this new central plan that's being put forth by, and we're going to get a lot into these people who are, these are the sincere idealists and men of considerable intellectual distinction. He's saying we have people who are taken seriously in Great Britain right now and who are putting forward these ideas, and they mean it, but these are the same arguments that were made in Germany in the past. So speaking of the past, Kevin, let's give a quick history lesson before we get into the bulk of this here. But my point is that that's what we're doing. We're going to add ourselves to that. So I'm going to go ahead and actually break down how we're going to frame this discussion before we get into the history. Is that cool?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that makes this so different is, and why it took so long, and as Kevin multiple times in our conversations, he's like, we're basically rewriting these chapters, and that's exactly right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at three things, and Kevin's going to give us a history thing, but then we're going to talk about maybe 6 different concepts or aspects of these 2 chapters, and we're going to look at what was the Germany of pre-World War I, post the Germany of that time period Hayek's referring to, of 20 or 30 years ago. And so we're going to look at that. And that's the ideas and the policies and everything that led to Nazism. And then we're going to look at the examples that Hayek gives of Great Britain. So that's the totalitarians in our midst. In chapter 13 is he's saying, so chapter 12 sets up all of the history in Germany, and why these go so well is that chapter 13 is Hayek just saying, here's how we would compare everything today with everything I just lined out in chapter 12, right? So he's looking at the German ideas and policies that led to Nazism. Then in chapter 12 or in 13, he's looking at the people in Great Britain at the time and their attitudes and their policy ideas that Hayek was saying is going to lead to some form of authoritarianism. And then the third thing that Kevin and I we're going to attempt to basically do the same thing in small measure. We're going to save a lot of that for the conclusion of the book. But in some small measure, give some contemporary analogs for some of these things. So what Hayek does in his comparing Great Britain, he quotes specific intellectuals. Like I said, he says a lot of these are the product of sincere idealists and men of considerable intellectual distinction. So Hayek quotes them, and he's saying, here's the ideas, and here's how it compares to Germany. We're going to do the same thing and say, here's some modern analogs that map really neatly onto that line, that progression of the ideas and those like policies and those attitudes. So that's one of the ways in which this and again, who knows how this is going to go. And so we'll see. But Kevin, why don't you give people a history? Is there anything you would add to what I just said? I feel like I just kind of rambled for like 7 minutes.
Yeah, I really think, on the German side, and we can't hammer this home enough. Even the history lesson I'm going through, chapter 12, the socialist roots of Nazism. When we think about German history, what's the first thing we think about? The limited history that we know and understand. Nazis, right? That's basically all I know. Really good engineers. They're super funny, and Nazis. That's what we know about Germans, right? Being a bit facetious there.
I'm like, yeah, German sense.
You've never seen it's a South Park episode where the Germans build the funniest robot in the world because someone accuses them of not being funny, and the German robot ends up killing everyone and says that's the ultimate joke. So very, very German. Anyways, little sidestep. We're not going to be talking
stuff.
Only a few more South Park references coming up. But the part about the German history is we are talking about everything before World War I and through World War I. We're not even touching Hitler. We're not getting to the Nazi stuff. This is all stuff that happened before then. And that's why I say it's important to understand that we think about German history, especially early 20th century. We just think Nazis, Nazis, Nazis. Hitler just appeared, took over, and they all became horrible racists and did all of these things. And we don't even give context to World War I and what's stuff that happened before World War I that led to this. So I think a lot of this, especially chapter 12, is understanding Germany didn't do this because they were Germans. This didn't just appear. This was a long road down the road to serfdom, name of the book, that we have to understand, contextualize, and build a trajectory for, so we can understand where we are, hopefully staying on our path to liberty and liberalism, or are we weaving off the path down to the road to serfdom like they are? And we analyze this with Britain, and we're going to try to, like you said, do our best to analyze this in the American context today. So we'll see if we can succeed, but there we go. So a quick history lesson. So we're going to start all the way back in 1871. So 1870 is the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War, and it ends in 1871. And this led to the unification of Germany in 1871. I just thought it was kind of funny. First of all, I always thought Germany's just kind of been a country since like forever. I even made the joke. I'm pretty sure at the beginning of the Old Testament, they referenced Jesus drinking beer out of a boot in Germany. Like I thought it was that old. No, it's relatively young. I mean, technically it's newer than the United States, but when they refer to Germany before,
by like 100 years.
Yeah. When they refer to Germany before 1871, because there are the Germans, right? It just refers to the countries that speak German tongue. Prussia was one of them. Yeah. So Prussia was one of them. Austria was another big one. Those were like the two big ones in Central Europe. And so they were kind of at war for the dominance of Central Continental Europe between them and France. Why the Franco-Prussian just means the France-Prussian or France-German War, where I think Napoleon III tries to go into Prussia to reassert France's dominance. I think they've had a couple of bad things happen to them that people thought they were weak, so they wanted to reassert their dominance. They march into Prussia, and Prussia actually ends up winning. And by Prussia, it means Germany, but led by the Kingdom of Prussia. And this is kind of unique because Prussia has this, what they call, and what is referred to several times in the book as this Prussian spirit, which is important to understanding the culture that was in Germany, that they thought liberalism was weakness because liberalism was in action, right? Ruling with an iron fist was much more of the mode in what the Prussian mode in which they understood, or the culture that they had. The warrior culture is even what they refer to, and so that becomes very important when we give the context of Germany when we go through this. So in 1895,
would you say that Prussian spirit is basically the early seeds of nationalism?
Yeah,
that we saw in Germany.
Nationalism, we'll even go through that. Socialism, the socialist ideas have been around since like the mid 18th century, and was prevalent in Prussia. So a lot of this stuff, again, it's cultural stuff. It's not like it's ingrained in their DNA, but it is culture, and culture is extremely important here. Really affected how Germany kind of grew up through the 19th century. So it's important to give that context. In addition, in 1895 through 1907 was around the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, and this when Germany became an economic powerhouse in the region. They weren't as big of an economy before then, and all of a sudden they started to boost their economic output with I think coal and steel. Like their steel production shot way up. So once you become an economic power, that's when people are going to start, seeing you, and you can build other things like an army. So, but the important detail here is
they had didn't they have at that point in time, they had the third largest economy in the world, and they had the largest economy in continental Europe. Mm-hmm. So when America, Great Britain, and Germany in this time. So they were serious business.
Yeah. And the important detail here too is even through the prosperity of the economic boom, anti-capitalist sentiments were on the rise as well. So when we think about, incentives like, oh, why didn't they just, progress into laissez-faire capitalism? Because normally that's what leads to this type of prosperity, especially this fast boom. Well, no, they're almost driving the culture in the opposite direction. And this might have something to do with, again, what we quote as the Prussian spirit, but they were still seeing the liberalism as weakness and organization as strength. Organization, again, a big buzzword that'll come through here. And the militaristic warrior culture was still ingrained in their society. And then once I'll get to it later, what happens after World War I, this is where it all the shit hits the fan, like we like to say. And when stuff, gets really wild, that projects them right into Nazism. And then, so in 1914 is the start of World War I, and this is an important detail we get to later. This is where they start the organized economy to fit the world needs, to fit the war needs. This is something we've talked about in previous chapters. I think Bruce Caldwell's even talked about it, how if Hayek would have seen, well, he did end up seeing, how even Britain had to organize for the war, that excuse would just be used to remain that as a constant economic condition. Like we organized all these things, we had to retrofit factories to fit wartime needs. And why not? Why don't we continue doing this in the future, even when there's no war? This is a way for planning to get its foot in the door, if you will. And then in 1919 was the end of World War I. They continued the war economy after the war. But also in the 1920s is a period in Germany where they had hyperinflation and economic depression. So they came from prosperity relatively shortly before that, and now huge economic depression. Economy even tanked before the stock market crash of 1929. And so the depression was also caused by war costs, post-war sanctions. They were hit pretty hard by the Allies.
Yeah, they had to pay reparations.
Yep. But what do they do to try to counteract reparations? They did the thing that it kind of sounds like we do that today, don't we? Hyperinflation was caused by out of control spending. They spent money they didn't have. So it ended up being like, I don't know how much, I don't even remember what their currency was in, but whatever, units, whatever they're buying. I keep thinking francs, but I'm pretty sure that's French.
Wasn't it Deutschmarks?
No, it wasn't that. It was something else. But whatever currency they're in, let's say, a loaf of bread would cost X amount of dollars. It was costing like literally trillions of dollars in their currency to buy a loaf of bread. Like insane, crazy inflation. And so they actually did a lot of this currency manipulation, that they built like this form of capital that was like super capital, but it was basically like bonds. Issued out to people, and they thought that would fix it. Also, it's one of the reasons that they went into war, because they kind of figured that, well, we'll just plunder during the war and gain all this capital back. And this is really, early, I would say like 17th, 16th century thinking, is that's what they did when they went to war. If they just needed, a bit more money, you could just, attack a country and plunder it. So that is, their motive, the Prussian spirit, their mode of thinking was a new war was going to get Germany's economy back on track. And then leading up to World War II, they blamed capitalism. And guess what? Who ends up being the face of capitalism? The Jews. This is why the Jews were attacked so viciously by Nazi Germany, because they had to create an outgroup. And when you create that outgroup, if you just label someone, okay, Jews are the face of this, the prosperous people within the country, we can blame them just like we blame the 1%, that we blame the capitalists. The Jews were considered just the capitalists. And this is why, they did what they did to the Jews. And this happens every single time you see a revolution like this, if you will. There has to be an outgroup created. And that outgroup, even though it seems awful, obviously it's awful what they did. When you can get a majority support behind it, and I don't think they had a majority support for, concentration camps or anything like that, but they certainly had majority support for getting them out of their towns and cities. So the things that we are willing to do, even as normal people, just because someone created an outgroup strong enough, will justify awful, horrible things.
Yeah, I mean, that's that Hoffer quote, right? That you can have a revolution or a mass movement without a belief in God, but never without belief in a devil, that you have to unify around that common enemy. Yeah, so that hopefully that helps people have just kind of even just that's one little section of things that we spent a lot of time researching and looking into. So hopefully that sets the stage a little bit here. And so the first, so I think I said there's about 6 things we're going to look at, and 3 of them are changes in kind of attitude and just temperament and spirit. And then the other 3 are kind of, well, what do you do once with those new ideas? Like, you have to put them into practice. And so first we're going to look at the shift in attitudes, and even just like, I think the importance of that is, well, actually I'll mention that later. So here's a quote that Hayek gives that kind of sets up that shift in attitude, where he says, "I stand little chance of conveying the equally important similarity in the emotional atmosphere. An extensive investigation into the subtle changes in thought and language," sound familiar, guys, "would be necessary to make explicit what one readily enough recognizes as symptoms of a familiar development. Through meeting the kind of people who talk about the necessity of opposing big ideas to small ones, and of replacing the old static and partial thinking by the new dynamic or global way, one learns to recognize that what at first appears sheer nonsense is a sign of the same intellectual attitude with whose manifestations we can alone concern ourselves here." And so what he's saying is you start to notice, before any of this crazy stuff is put into place, there's a change in rhetoric, there's a change in emotion, there's a change in the way people are talking about things. And at first it'll either seem like nonsense or you'll just be confused. But once you understand, once you realize it, then it's one of those things where you go, oh, I know what we're dealing with here. So think about just the way words like equity or inclusion, or even before, equality or compassion or democracy, as Kevin said, like there's these subtle changes in how things are discussed, or anti-racism. Okay, yeah, but that now, once you're like, oh, I know what I'm dealing with here. Whenever someone's dropping these, and we've all experienced this, whenever you hear someone dropping these buzzwords, it's like, oh, I know what we're dealing with here. And so we'll spend the first 3 sections here going over changes in, that's zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, changes in the emotions and in the rhetoric and the way people are thinking about stuff that was taking place in Germany, and then Hayek was observing in Great Britain, and then we'll give some contemporary analogs for those as well. But that's what we're going to be going over here first.
Yeah, and I think another important detail, much like we did in the last chapter, or that we kind of learned about in the last chapter, was you have to make, when you make these attitude changes, you can call them, we are, I guess, informed enough to know the buzzwords like equity. When they change out equality for equity, we know, oh, I know what you're doing. But what they try to do for the everyday person is either not notice a change, or when they notice a change, they do the thing that they do with the new moral code. Oh no, this is something you've always believed in. It's just a different way to say it. That's the important part here, and that's how they sell it to the masses, is this is something we always believed. It's just, this is a new way of saying it, I guess, or it's this old idea that we want to move away from, that again is old and outdated, and we don't want to use it anymore because we're progressive. We're trying to build a new, better world, trying to build that utopia. So it's important to have the people believe this is their idea. Every good salesman is able to implant the idea to buying their product in your head as if it was your idea.
Yep.
And that's really what they do here.
Yeah, totally agree. And the other thing that I would add to that is that we also do that to ourselves. Like, that's what Daniel Kahneman writes about in Thinking Fast and Slow, that we have these mental heuristics where we do, I think it's called replacement, where if someone says something and you're not quite sure what they're talking about, your mind will interchange it with something else, and then you start to agree or think that that's what they're talking about, even though it's not. So I think I used this example in a past episode, but it's like, how many people, when they first heard the word equity, thought that meant equality? Like probably 70% of people, if not more, right? And so they didn't go, well, why is that a different word? That must mean something different. They just mentally said, oh, they made the shift. So yeah. And then in the cases where that's not possible, then they'll sell you on it, how that's, yeah, this is what you've always thought.
Yeah. So the first kind of what I'll call inherent attitudes, the attitude changes, is what we labeled as the abandoned road to liberalism, because liberalism is labeled as weak. And they use the word weak a lot because it's opposed to this German strength that they want to throw out there. So from chapter 12, the German context, there's a German socialist named Paul Lensch, and he wrote in 1918, quote, "To put it plainly, our conceptions of liberalism, democracy, and so forth are derived from the ideas of English individualism, according to which the state with a weak government is a liberal state, and every restriction upon the freedom of the individual is conceived as a product of autocracy and militarism." So weak government is a liberal state, which me as a conservative, I'm like, okay, I'm fine with a weak government, but weak is this buzzword. Yeah, it's like, no, you don't want weak in anything, right? It's the idea. What was the other word? Discrimination. Like discrimination is not inherently a bad thing, just as weakness is not technically inherently a bad thing, depending on the context you put it in. You can discriminate against something for a very good reason. As a doctor hiring another doctors, I discriminate people who don't have a medical degree, right? That's a good type of discrimination. But this idea that liberalism is weak is a common theme we see throughout both chapters 12 and 13. Weakness, which in the German context is opposed to the Prussian strength, the thing we talked about before, and will be advertised as a bad thing. Weakness is always a bad thing to them. This makes sense. Weakness sounds bad. I mean, it always sounds bad, right? But it is the weakness of the state that gives the power to the people and the individual. But this is an outdated idea, according to Lensch. And Lensch continues on, writing again in 1918, quote, "The class of people who unconsciously reason from English standards comprises the whole educated German bourgeoisie. The political notions of freedom and civic right, of constitutionalism and parliamentarism are derived from that individualistic conception of the world of which English liberalism is a classical embodiment, and which was adopted by the spokesmen of the German bourgeoisie in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of the 19th century. But these standards are old-fashioned and shattered. But just as old-fashioned English liberalism has been shattered by this war." Remember writing this in 1918. So even losing the war, they still believe these ideas have been shattered. The ideological war has been won, even though the physical war has been lost. To continue on, what has to be done now is to get rid of these inherent political ideas and to assist the growth of a new conception of state and society. In this sphere, socialism must present a conscious and determined opposition to individualism. So their idea here is to get rid of the old-fashioned ideas of freedom and liberty. The individual is just a social concept. So this is something I told you I just thought about yesterday. When you label something a social concept like gender, or the idea of even like traditional gender roles, is just this idea we come up with that we play around. It's not there. It's not physical. You can't touch it. You can't feel it. So we can get rid of it if we want to. That is the individual. There's no such thing in the individual. We are all a collective. And that is what they try to sell you by getting rid of that old fashioned idea of liberalism. And they say that we must grow out of these naive, childish ideas and assist the growth of a new concept of state and society and live together in harmony. Doesn't that sound nice? And I'm pretty sure for everyone who's tried this, it's always worked out for them. So why not do it now?
Yeah. And even just to add to what you said real fast on the German context. So chapter 12 opens with a quote from a German cultural historian named Arthur Moeller Vanderbroek, who said, all the anti-liberal forces are coming together against everything that is liberal. And whenever we first read it, we thought that he was complaining, but he's actually celebrating that idea. Mm-hmm. He's saying, and he wrote that in 1931. Mm-hmm. So before the war even started, so like you just said, they thought that even though they lost the physical war, the ideological war had been won. He's like, finally, all the anti-liberal forces are coming together against all of this weak, liberalism. Which I think
depending on the tone that you read that in, you're like, oh man, this guy is like, he's got a point. He's highlighting something really good here. No, this guy was like championing this idea. He's like, isn't this a great thing, guys? And that just goes to show you when people like misread your text, like, oh, you took this in a way I did not mean it. This is how that happens. Like, it's all about the tone in which you read it and the background context in which you can decipher the information.
Yep. So that's where this opposition to liberalism and a weak government was occurring in Germany prior to the war. And then what Hayek in Great Britain was noticing. So I'm going to be quoting a few people whenever we're talking about Great Britain. One of them is a guy named Professor Carr. There's another one named C.H. Waddington. The best way to think about those people is that, it seems like every, era, or at least in modern history, has some intellectuals who have credibility for reasons that I can't possibly understand, that are trotted out to legitimize and just put forth these garbage, idiotic ideas. Like our modern examples would be like Ibram Kendi or Kimberly Crenshaw or Robin DiAngelo or like Mark Lamont Hill or something, people who are just putting forth just completely asinine, ridiculous
or they're
ideas.
Experts in other fields. Like, so someone comes to mind is Noam Chomsky, which as a linguist, I've heard, I don't know much of his material in linguism. I believe it's linguist, is like the expert. Like no one has ever been better than him. Guy's a genius, but then he makes comments on economics and he's a complete moron. So that's the way I think about this. Some of these people are experts in other fields, but like,
Bill Nye the Science Guy, right?
Yeah.
Chomsky sucks on economics, but there are other things he's quite good on. But yeah, so it's a stay in your lane kind of thing. Sam Harris comes to mind, honestly, with some of this stuff. Anyway, but so Professor Carr and C.H. Waddington are like Hayek's version of Robin DiAngelo, except for instead of like critical race theory, they're the ones out there like trying to make good spirited arguments, and they're being treated as legitimate, except for it's for planning and socialism. So Professor Carr, and he calls liberal economics, he also does, so they were saying this in Germany, he also calls liberal economics 19th century ideas. And one of his arguments for abandoning liberalism, he says, in other words, nothing but expediency matters. And we are even assured that the rule pacta sunt servanda, which means agreements must be kept, so is not a moral principle. Without abstract general principles, which means a functioning system, merit becomes solely a matter of arbitrary opinion. This is Professor Carr saying this. And so that liberalism as a 19th century idea is all that we care about is expediency. And we don't have to necessarily keep our agreements with people or have a functioning society where I think we got into this in maybe chapter 6, where people know what to expect the next day. I think that this is in the rule of law one. All that matters is being able to shove through our system, our plan as fast as possible. And liberalism is an antiquated notion that prevents us from doing that. And so that's one of the ideas that Hayek was seeing in Great Britain was, this is just, and this is even in the introduction, right? It's like the thing that got us here was not seen as a necessary component for prosperity, but as a hindrance to prosperity. And so, I mean, that's in the chapter 1, The Abandoned Road. And for our contemporary context, one, if you just Google liberalism has failed, you'll find a myriad of articles and books on the topic from both left and right, which is fascinating because you'll see people on the far left saying liberalism doesn't work because exactly what Professor Carr said, it gets in the way of this expedient method of just shoving our plan through regardless of consensus or how anyone feels about it, because we're so convinced of how good it is. And you see people on the right saying it's failed because it's ruined morality or for some of these social reasons or something along those lines. And so you see people on both the left and right teaming up against it, again, to go to that Muller-Vanderbroek thing. It's like you see anti-liberal forces uniting against everything that's liberal. And but there's this one article in a publication called The Week that I found. It's called America's Constitution is Terrible. Let's throw it out and start over. And they said, here's 5 radical ways to fix our broken democracy, to use that buzzword you talked about there. And number 5 was throw the entire Constitution in the garbage because it makes change too difficult, and change requires, and what he meant is, because the guy gets into it in the article, is that change requires consensus in our government. Like, it's really hard to make changes if you don't have bipartisan support. And so you have to throw out the Constitution because consensus is irrelevant. Our dumbass plan is what matters here. And again, that goes back to even just the Hayek quote at the beginning, where you see this rush to abandon everything that's worked in the past and stake everything on some new system because we just believe that it will work. So you see attacks on liberalism in Great Britain under Hayek in Hayek's time, and then you see attacks on liberalism here today. I mean, the fact that the right even turned it into a slur, I think, is telling of this assault. I mean, Hayek even wrote about that, but the attack on liberalism in America has been going on for at least 70 years, probably, if not more. But there are a lot of contemporary analogs for that as well.
I think there's a lot of covert attacks on liberalism because, as Hayek also mentioned, that liberalism in the American context does not mean what it means in the European context, where it's, the exact opposite, actually. So I think the left can claim they love liberalism while attacking at the same time. They'll attack, which effectively is just conservatism now in the American context. Again, conservatism means something different depending on where you're at, because it depends on what they're conserving. But conservatives, mostly in the American context, is just liberalism, right? Rubin talks about classical liberalism. That is damn near just conservatism at this point. It's that kind of language change that allows them to attack it covertly instead of so overtly, which is obviously a smarter way to do it now. So something you mentioned here was you notice that there's a myriad of articles of people attacking liberalism on the left and on the right. Well, and it's interesting because that goes into our next inherent attitude, which is the left and right coming together to push organization, planning, and socialism. That actually the left and right coming together is kind of a red flag, of the not looking at the extremes on both sides, but looking at the main political parties, what word am I thinking of? Establishment. There we go. Establishment on each side, kind of talking with each other and disagreeing on everything's kind of a red flag. It's like, oh, depending on what they're agreeing on, I suppose, is this might not be going well anymore. And this is kind of what he talks about here, and it's given. So I'll blow through all of this in the German, British, and contemporary context because they kind of line up the quotes almost exactly. So the first one taken from German context is taken directly from Hayek, and it's quote, "It was not merely the defeat, the suffering, and the wave of nationalism which led to their success meaning the Germans. It was the union of the anti-capitalist forces of the right and of the left, the fusion of radical and conservative socialism, which drove out from Germany everything that was liberal." So he says the left and right version of socialism. This is why his entry quote to the book is he wrote the book to the socialists of both parties. This is what he was referring to right at the beginning to say, don't, even if the conservative establishment advertises as they're pro-capitalist, well, a lot of the things that President Bush did were not very pro-capitalist. Actually, he grew the state, if anything. So it's something you got to watch out for from both sides, no matter how they advertise themselves. To continue, the connection between socialism and nationalism in Germany was close from the beginning. It was significant that the most important ancestors of National Socialism, Fichte, Robertus, and Lassalle, are at the same time acknowledged as the fathers of socialism. These people were talking in Germany or in German culture a long time ago. Germany just didn't slide into authoritarianism slowly because they lost World War I and their economy was spiraling. It was over a century of socialist thought mixed together with nationalist pride, again, coming from Prussia. And the first father of socialism, the Hayek listed there with his Johann Fichte, actually started talking about this stuff in the early 19th century. Like I said before, they were talking about this stuff a long time ago. It was really ingrained in their culture. And then to get to chapter 13, the British context, Hayek goes on to say, quote, "We have already mentioned the most significant, the increasing similarity between economic views of the right and the left and their common opposition to liberalism that used to be the common basis of most English politics." So Hayek repeatedly states that the socialist forces on the left and right now warns that we must be aware when those forces begin to agree and collude. Think of the sympathetic to communism politicians and activists of the left and the high-spending militaristic leaders on the right. Both of them are not fond of liberalism that allowed our society to prosper at this point. I mean, these people effectively, to go on to the contemporary context we see today, the establishment of the left and the establishment of the right have the same basic economic and foreign policies. They're allowing you to, they throw out Ted Cruz, they throw out AOC, they say, oh, this is what we believe, let's go fight, let's write a bunch of mean articles and tweets about how these people act, and this is how we're going to advertise ourselves while we're back here all disagreeing with each other. And they except for a few outliers, both sides support the same policies and grow the power and size of the state. So we see this today, and it should be a red flag if you see people who advertise as disagreeing with each other and actually just are glad handing, in the background. I think it's important to see it for what it is, and something we talked about in the End of Truth. They're lying to you. If they're false advertising to you, that's just lying. As you just wrote down here, things that come to mind, the Patriot Act, and that was something that I would say I would have agreed with if I were old enough back then to understand what it is. And I passions were high. It's the same thing when it comes to war. Whenever there's this large catalyzing event, that is kind of what should I believe, I forgot who said it, never let a tragedy go to waste.
Rahm Emanuel.
Rahm Emanuel, yeah.
He was Barack Obama. Well, he's originally Chicago's mayor, but then he was Barack
Yeah.
Obama's like chief of staff or something like that.
Right. So yeah, never let a tragedy go to waste. This is a way to push very, very radical policy that if we were to like stand back and more non-emotional and read this through today, we're like, oh, no way. Compassionate conservatism, something that comes from George W. Bush. When he said this, I don't know if George W. Bush or his father, I think it was his father who first said that, to which President Reagan's
It was
widow,
George Bush. It was George Bush that said it originally.
Yeah. But I think it was Reagan's widow who said when he said this in one of his campaign speeches, she's like, as opposed to what kind of conservatism? Because that was just a shot at Ronald Reagan, saying his version of conservatism was not passionate enough. And then stuff like COVID stimulus, they're both the establishment agreeing on sending this out, which is just beta testing UBI and different economic policies. And it's all of these things are to make sure that you become aware of, if they're advertising as enemies, but they're hanging out at the same bars after work, they're hanging out at the same golf clubs, maybe you should be more concerned that they're lying to you. The end of truth concept, this should be a red flag for all of us, and we should really understand, like, oh, hey, we should actually see what they're doing. And especially when they're doing more, especially when they're growing the state, that just means they're gathering more power, concentrating more power. Both sides want to do it. And that's something that we truly need to worry about. And we saw it in Germany. We saw it in Britain. We're seeing it today in the United States. And we need to understand the trajectory.
Yeah. Michael Malice recently tweeted out, I think it's some of the effect of, conservatives' main criticism of socialism is the cost. In other words, they're cool with all these policies. Like, there's a reason why no like conservative has even tried to seriously, at least in recent decades, tackle the idea of cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Like, despite the fact that that entitlement programs are like 67% of our national budget, and that's honestly, I don't know, a figure from maybe a year. Well, it's a pre-COVID figure. But yeah, so I think that's exactly right. I mean, then we've gotten into enough of the, contemporary American conservatism is just, progressivism driving the speed limit. And again, there's a reason for that. And I think Malice is completely dead on. So
100%. So I think if we're ready to go on to the next and the last kind of inherent attitude before we get to this type of progression, which is the individual must be subservient to the state. Obviously, it's very obvious. We've seen this in Germany. I can give the German context real fast. From Sombart to, I forgot what his title was, but I know he was in Germany, as summarized by Hayek, quote, the life, there is a life higher than the individual life, the life of the people and the life of the state. And it is the purpose of the individual to sacrifice himself for that higher life. The state must come before the individual. The individual must be subservient to the state. Sacrifice for the higher life will become mandatory. It starts out as voluntary. We're going to get into a quote later, I think, from Lynch, that he's like, this stuff, like, we tried to make it voluntary, and then we saw, liberalism became an obstacle to planning. So now we got to get rid of the voluntary piece because it's way too inconvenient. It starts out as we recommend masks. Well, first it starts out as we recommend no masks, and then we recommend masks, and now we mandate masks. And now we're going to create an outgroup of all those people who are not wearing a mask are evil Trump supporters and racists. And this is how you create an outgroup. And this is the way that you have everyone else volunteer their rights and volunteer their liberties away to the coercive power, because they want to battle against the outgroup, and they begin to understand that this behavior is not going to be mandatory anymore.
Yeah, and that Sombart guy that you quoted, that dude was straight up he was like an expert on Marx. In fact, if I remember right, Engels said that no one understood Das Kapital better than Sombart. So he's a Professor
Werner Sombart. I finally found him. German authority on Marx. Yep.
Yeah, it was either him or Lynch that was I think it was him. Yep. Yeah, that Engels said that about. Here's another quote. So there's that denigration of the individual and saying that they're subservient to the state. Here's quoting Professor Carr again. He said, we can no longer find much meaning in the distinction familiar to 19th century thought between society and state. So again, he's talking about liberalism. And Professor Carr in Hayek's time in Great Britain was saying, like, look, again, here's another one of these 19th century ideas that we should make a distinction between society and the state. It's like, no, the state's part of everything and the individual and everything. And in fact, there's a quote goes on later. It says the state itself, and this is from Hayek, where he's talking about how this has worked out. He said the state itself becomes more and more identified with the interests of those who run things rather than the interest of the individuals in general, or the people in general. And so, and that's how the cathedral works. We've talked about that before, but the point is that Hayek was observing that in Great Britain, that denigration of the individual, denigration of liberalism is about the individual and the individual's right to self-determination. I mean, it really is the spirit of the, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and Declaration of Independence. And so, the idea, like, I don't want to breeze by like how completely dystopian and insane the idea that the state is not subservient to the individual is. Like, this is a juxtaposition of epic proportions. This is saying that the state doesn't answer to us, we answer to the state, and that we answer to the politicians and not the other way around. And that's a big deal problem. And some of the contemporary analogs. So Berkeley has this website. They have many websites, obviously, but part of the Berkeley's website is this greater good thing. And it's literally called the greater good. And they had an article about dealing with mass vaccination and how do you, it's like 5 steps of what do you do with people if they're not interested in getting vaccinated. How do you convince them? We've seen a lot of these, by the way, and it's really scary stuff because I know what a step-by-step like tutorial on relationship building for the purpose of like evangelism looks like. And they're almost all, with the exception of the conclusion of this one, the exact, almost word for word in a lot of the ways of how do you do evangelism to convert someone to your religion? And it's the same thing. How do you do evangelism to convince someone to get vaccinated? But what do they say on this Berkeley's website? They say, if we can tie mass vaccination into people's sense of unity and common purpose, it can make a dent in the vaccine resistant. Use words like, it's not just about you. We've got to do this together. So there's that appeal to the common good, the greater good, or whatever, which we've seen used as, that's the same language Hayek talks about in planning, use the common good as this kind of vague notion of what you're going to be putting into place. By the way, the conclusion of that article, step 5, was, if none of that works, distance yourself and just throw like vaccine only parties and just don't hang out with them anymore because you have to protect yourself. So cut ties with the unwashed. That's beautiful. There was also an article I found in the Atlantic that says, quote, Americans have allowed ourselves to believe that the self rather than the community must do the healing. COVID-19 is a stark reminder that the community rather than the self may be the first line of protection. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that changes are worth the cost. It changes. It begins with taking a structural rather than individualistic view of problems facing the U.S. today. In other words, give the government more control over people, over what people can and can't do. That article had a whole bunch of stuff about how the fact that we live in an individualist country and left stuff to people's own, ideas and everything like that, that's a big problem. I even did a video, I think, quite a while ago about this article I think I read on ABC or NBC where the woman who was writing it was complaining about how in America we've, it's a bug that we are leaving things up to personal responsibility rather than a feature. And so yeah, we see this denigration of the individual today. And a lot of times we've done this in a lot of our conversations where we use COVID kind of as the analog, but there's a reason for that. One is it's that crisis that's not going to waste, and 2, it's just obviously relevant. It's impacting everything that we see. So, but that denigration of the individual has been around for a while. In fact, a lot of the arguments of the Patriot Act were like that. It's like, well, why do you care if you're not breaking the law? And so, and I was one of the idiots that thought that was a reasonable argument at the time. So.
Well, I was one of the idiots who didn't think that was a good argument, but I was also like, well, whatever. If I have to give up this, then, I'll be fine. I'm not really a person who cares much. I'm not someone who keeps my curtains closed to the outside world because I don't want people looking into my house. If you do, I think you're weird, but, whatever. I don't think I have anything to be ashamed of. But that's a version of giving up my autonomy, giving up my freedom. Not thinking of it as a responsibility, just thinking of it as a convenience. And I think that's another large piece of this. Is too much of us, the theme in so many chapters, we don't look at this freedom thing as a risk and responsibility, but again, as a convenience that can be tossed away, but it will be given back to us eventually, right? Once COVID's over, it's going to be given back to us, I bet.
Sure. Yeah. So that's just to kind of summarize. We just went through, the shifts in attitude, right, and the shifts in what people were saying, that, as Hayek said, subtle shifts in language and all that other stuff. But here's the thing: the way shifts in attitude, shifts in mentality and perceptions and values, like a shift from individualism to collectivism is a shift in values, and shifts in values and attitudes are precursors for policy shifts. They're shifts in action, right? Like once you've changed your values, just a perfect example. If you are doing a thing that you used to enjoy doing and now you don't do it anymore, as your attitude shifts to where that thing doesn't bring you as much enjoyment, you stop doing it and you might do something different instead. So shifts in attitudes, they have implications. And so we're going to look at, like, here's kind of Hayek's, here's a few more Hayek quotes that I think actually tee up the next three components that we're going to discuss. Because they all connect, but they're the practicalities on the other side of what happens when the attitude shifts. So what Hayek says is, possibly we have not given enough attention to one feature of the intellectual development in Germany during the last 100 years, which is now in almost identical form making its appearance in this country. The scientists agitating for a scientific organization of countries. So they're agitating to put these ideas and plans into practice. And he quotes, so there's a guy named C.H. Waddington. He's another one of those, just think of him as like our version of Kendi, but for planning. So Waddington wrote this book called The Scientific Attitude, which, by the way, was published January 1st, 1941. So this is almost a year before the U.S. entered World War II. It wasn't that long after the invasion of France to have been a significant influence. But my point is that Waddington was arguing for this scientific attitude before they even knew how the war was going to conclude. And anyway, Hayek used that. It says it's a good example as any of a class of literature which is actively sponsored by the influential weekly Nature. So Nature is the name of the magazine, and which combines claims for greater political power for the scientists or the experts with an ardent advocacy of wholesale planning. And one thing that's fascinating about him referencing Nature there, Nature magazine, I think I'll quote this here really fast before I get into Nature, is actually in the beginning of the introduction of the book. You see Hayek said, as the war drew to a close, entities like Science magazine had advocated that science was to be used after the war to help form a more advanced society, reconstructed along more rational lines. And so these publications have been captured in a lot of ways for a long time now. And I do think it's worth just getting into Nature magazine that he initially quoted, that was running this thing by Waddington. They're also, even today, they were running pieces. Whenever we read this, I'm like, why do I think there's some modern examples of Nature just being absolute garbage? They were running articles a year ago about how irresponsible it was to want to investigate the origins of the COVID. They said the lab leak hypothesis is irresponsible science because it could lead to hostilities or something like that. And it's like a scientific magazine, Nature magazine, Heather Heying called it literally one of the two most prestigious scientific publications in the world. And they were saying that this is irresponsible. But even freaking 80 years ago, they were doing the same crap, but arguing for planning. And Science magazine is saying that we need to keep these things going after the war, and how science can help us reconstruct society along more rational lines. So the point is, why I'm saying that is, these attitudes existed before the war, and you have all these naive experts waiting in the wings for an excuse to implement their dumbass plan. That's what Hayek said in the beginning of that quote. He's like, there are real deal intellectuals. There are people here who are arguing for these things, and they're sincere about it. They're sincere about it. Their sincerity has no relationship to whether or not it's the sanity of the idea, or it's a good idea, or it's workable, but they are sincere about it. And these are the people, and we even got into this in that conversation about the death of truth, I think, is when we talked about the cathedral, and how it's like whenever you had this thing happen at the beginning of the 20th century, where people were starting to wanting to appeal to these experts, it's like saying, why doesn't Gandalf just put on the ring in Lord of the Rings? And the problem, and this is again quoting Yarvin, is he says, whenever Gandalf puts on the ring, he just becomes Saruman. That's that quote, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I believe, was that Voltaire, I think? That might be wrong, but I think it was. Either way, that's what happens. And so that's why these scientists, after a few decades of that notion marinating, and the power that's being granted to these people, after that's introduced to the equation, now they're like, give us power. We need to do this. That's where Hayek says here, he's like, there is this argument for, we need to have more political power and political responsibility and influence. Just trust the experts. And so you have people that are not elected, that there's literally no check on them, literally, that are outside of our government, that are running the government and dictating policy, and there's nothing to keep them in check. But anyway, so my point is that you have people advocating for planning, as decided and run by experts before the war, and then they see the war, or war metaphors, as Bruce Caldwell hints at the introduction, as an excuse to implement, or further implement in some cases, their plan. And then they want to do it. They want to continue that and consolidate their power after the war. And it's just so convenient that the same people advocating for this stuff would be at the top of the power hierarchy whenever it's implemented. Like, what a random thing that it just so happens that they would also have all the power. Like, you have Ayanna Pressley saying, we need a anti-racist amendment and a Department of Anti-Racism that can literally check any law, anything, state or federal, and there's no check on it. And it's like, gee, I wonder if Ayanna Pressley would want to be involved in the Department of Anti-Racism. Probably not, right? Like, she would want someone else to do that. She wouldn't want to have total unilateral control of the government. So anyway, so these are a few of the things that we're going to get into of just like the practical application of those attitude shifts and everything, and the role that experts, sincere or not, that they play in that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we'll end. So we kind of have a progression here. We set forth all the attitudes that were found in Germany, Britain, and of course, I think even the United States. And now we get onto this progression of these different ideas that must take hold, the one before the other, before you really go down the road to serfdom, and then it's going to be hard to find your way back. So I think that was a really, really good setup there. So the first stage that we're going into is called, or that we named it, is it's time for organization and planning. Again, organization, the German buzzword for it, planning, the British buzzword for it. So in chapter 12, Hayek quotes Johann Plenge, who's a professor and expert on Marxism. All these guys love Marxism, especially for Nazis who apparently hated Marx. He wrote in 1914, and then that he believed that there was, quote, a conflict between the ideas of 1789, the idea of freedom, and the ideas of 1914, the idea of organization. There was a direct conflict between the old idea of liberalism and the new idea of socialism and organization, basically planning. And then Hayek continues to give his commentary by saying, in 1914, Plenge still believed there could be liberalism and socialism through voluntary submission of the individual to the whole. But by 1918, Plenge no longer believed liberalism had a role in organization, because liberalism constrains and dissipates power by constantly putting it at odds with itself. Socialism, so another quote, I think this one's directly from Plenge, socialism has to win power. It must never blindly destroy power. It has to win it, must never blindly destroy it. Again, we get to this idea that we saw before, the old ideas of liberalism put up against the new idea of planning, the ideas of 1789, which refers to the French Revolution, the birth of the American Constitution, where freedom reigned supreme, and the ideas of 1914, which refers to the German socialist ideas at the start of World War I. In 1914, Plenge still believed socialist planning and organization could still work in society that still believes in freedom and the individual, but by 1918, which was near the end of World War I, Plange no longer believed that liberal ideas could be tolerated in a planned society because it naturally blocks concentration of power. This is the only logical conclusion of a planned society. As we talked about before, why the worst get on top. You ask yourself that question at the beginning. You say, oh, I have a couple ideas as to why they might get on top, or might get on top most of the time. By the end of that chapter, like, it's the only logical conclusion. It's the same way here. Even democratic socialism, where they say, well, there's democratic element in it that allows it to make everyone's lives better democratically, that slowly gets taken out because it naturally becomes an obstacle to the power needed to enforce the plan, to enforce organization, to enforce their version of a democracy of equity, right? So it's the only logical conclusion of planning, where the plannings must have all the power. Hayek continues by saying, quote, the ideal of a society organized through and through from the top has in Germany been considerably furthered by the quite unique influence which her scientific and technological specialists were allowed to exercise on the formation of social and political opinions. Few people remember that in modern history of Germany, the political professors have played a role comparable to that of the political lawyers in France. The influence of these scientist politicians was of late years not often on the side of liberty. The intolerance of reason so frequently conspicuous in the scientific specialist, the impatience with the ways of the ordinary man so characteristic of the expert, the contempt for anything which was not consciously organized by superior minds according to the scientific blueprint, were phenomena familiar in German public life for generations before they became significant in this country, end quote. This goes into the idea that we'll expand on more later, but is something we've talked about in plenty of episodes before. Freedom and liberty take a backseat to a plan supported by experts, right? This buzzword experts we see a million times, who feel superior to the everyday man. He talked about, it must be organized by superior minds. A society run by superior minds is the ideal for the planner, especially since most of them, like you just said, it's kind of funny that you said the thing you said before, like all these people, advocating for this stuff, will just happen to find themselves running it, right? It just happens to end up that way. This is a lot of the experts. They believe that a society run by superior minds means that they're going to be the ones have the superior minds. They're the one who's going to be running it. How convenient is that, right? So I think it's funny that you and I were on the same track with that idea. But, this is a prevalent idea within Germany at the time, as you go into a prevalent idea within Britain, and this is like a prerequisite for the next few steps that we're going to explain in a little bit.
Yep. Yeah. And even just this organization and planning comes as a result of that denigration of the past that we talked about, right? Like whenever you destroy something, like it creates a vacuum that will be replaced. And so they have this plan waiting in the winds. I mean, that was part of the long march to the institutions, was changing them. And part of a lot of like the cultural Marxism was denigrating, the church, the family, all of our ties with the past, so that people have nothing they're grounded to, and will just, say, okay, yeah, why not do this other thing? Because I don't feel a connection to the thing that we were doing. And Hayek dedicates an entire chapter to Britain's new obsession with planning. And
someone say an entire book.
Yes, right. It's really funny. Fair enough. But he has a chapter called The Inevitability of Planning. So I'm just going to read a quote from that chapter. If we're going to look at the British, what Hayek was seeing there. So it was happening in Germany, this obsession with planning, and, let's put superior minds, that how they hated anything that wasn't organized, So Hayek says it's revealing it's a revealing fact that few planners are content to say that central planning is desirable. Most of them affirm that we can no longer choose, but are compelled by circumstances beyond our control to substitute planning for competition, almost like people might generate random bullshit to justify the use of the thing that they want you to do. The myth is deliberately cultivated that we are embarking on a new course, not out of free will, but because competition is spontaneously eliminated by technological changes, which we neither can reverse nor should wish to prevent. Of the various arguments employed to demonstrate the inevitability of planning, the one most frequently heard is that technological changes have made competition impossible in a constantly increasing number of fields, and that the only choice left to us is between control of production by private monopolies and direction by the government. This belief derives mainly from the Marxist doctrine of the concentration of industry, although, like so many Marxist ideas, it is now found in many circles which have received it at third or fourth hand and do not know from whence it derives. So Hayek is, that quote is so amazing, and that's also very contemporarily relevant. But Hayek is saying there's these people arguing for the inevitability of planning, and they're not just saying it'd be a good thing, but they're saying we can't avoid it. And one of the arguments that they were seeing was technology. Where we see, you mentioned UBI. What are we saying? Well, this new economy, like we're going to have UBI and all of these universal pre-K and all these programs that grow the government. It's inevitable. It's just the circumstances, guys. We're going to have to do that. And it's always completely delusional. And again, by the way, I was reading about the history of Great Britain, like after World War II, and they had conservative leaders after Neville Chamberlain lost to Winston Churchill. Yeah. And actually, I think it went Neville Chamberlain and then someone else and then Winston Churchill.
No, it was Churchill after Neville Chamberlain and then someone else and then Churchill again.
Really?
Wikipedia is correct. Yes.
Oh, wow. Well, Wikipedia got a few dates wrong on something I was looking at yesterday.
Wikipedia,
I'm like, well, that's impossible. Right. That one might be right, but I'm saying I was reading. We were talking about it yesterday. I'm like, what the? This is actually impossible. But anyway, but then in 1960s, the decade that ruined everything, one of them, they implemented. They had.
Oh, not talking about civil rights, by the way.
We say 60s. God, that's hilarious. No, definitely not. I'm talking about like activist jurisprudence and stuff.
Yep. Okay.
But anyway, that's really funny. Damn civil rights. Although there is a really good book that argues that the Civil Rights Act was worded in such a way that it was an absolute travesty for individual liberty. Obviously not the parts getting rid of segregation.
Exactly.
But, yep. Anyway, but Great Britain brings in a labor government and it leads to like inflation and all this other stuff and economic stagnation. And they were worried that a recession was going to come on. And then they bring in Margaret Thatcher in 1979. So they play around with socialist ideas for 15 years. And lo and behold, it's an absolute disaster. Who thought? And then our contemporary example, here is that if you're going to talk about planning, and we're going to talk a lot about the climate activists in this section, but is that here's a quote from AOC's former, I think, chief of staff or advisor. I forgot what his first name is. His last name is Chakrabarty, but here's a quote. The interesting thing about the New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all, Chakrabarty said to Inslee being Jay Inslee's climate director, Sam Ricketts, according to a Washington Post reporter who attended the meeting for a profile published Wednesday. Do you guys think of it as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a how do you change, restructure, organize, plan the entire economy thing, he added. The Green New Deal proposed earlier this year by Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey would transition the U.S. economy entirely away from fossil fuels within 10 years while simultaneously providing a federal jobs and healthcare guarantee. It would also, according to its proponents, advance social, economic, racial, regional, and gender-based justice and equality and cooperative and public ownership. End quote. So he's saying, do you guys think of the Green New Deal as a climate thing? Because for us, it's just, you can substitute in central planning. It literally is a reorgan. He says, he says right there, how do you change the entire economy thing? So
he's the idiot who says the quiet part out loud.
Totally. He was fired not long after that, if I recall. Because it's like, you idiot, you're not supposed to give the game away.
Right.
But of course, I think the mistake they make is assuming that people are paying attention because no one is paying attention. But but anyway, but we see this call for organization. It's inevitable, whether it's UBI or, we have to use climate change, or we have to use COVID or whatever to restructure the entire economy. Like Hayek was seeing it there in his time. People were saying it was inevitable and they were basing it on Marxist ideas, and they didn't know that they were basing it on Marxist ideas. And the same freaking thing is happening here, where we see it today, where people were saying it's inevitable that we have to, concentrate all this power at the top and restructure the economy and restructure all of society. And again, people are basing it on Marxist ideas, and they don't realize they're arguing for Marxist ideas. So,
yeah, toward the end of chapter 13, Hayek kept bringing up, here's this guy who blamed the same stupid ideas we've debunked before, like inevitable or whatever prosperity, and you plan an economy, there will always be prosperity, where it's literally never showed up that way. And yeah, it's people just trying to drag out the same old talking points. And it would be funny if it wasn't so sad.
Yep.
So the next stage in the progression that we went through that he highlighted a lot, he's got a ton of quotes from chapter 12 in here, is the war economy. And it's the war economy gets planning's foot in the door, and it's there to stay. So once it's in there, it's impossible to get out, right? It's that power dynamic. Once you have power there, there's no way to eliminate it anymore. So the German context, he quotes Professor Warren Sombart from before, in which he said in 1915, Sombart welcomed the German war as an inevitable conflict between commercial civilization of England and the heroic culture of Germany. His contempt for the commercial views of English people who had lost all warlike instincts is unlimited. So this is the Prussian warlike instinct we talked about before. If you're not into war, if you're not a warrior culture, you're a weakling, and we want nothing to do with you. We want none of that. A culture within our German society built for warriors. In his mind, losing that instinct makes a society comfortable. Like I think he used the word comfortable. I don't know if I quoted all of them here, but yeah. So in the next quote, he even says English comfort.
Freedom turns you into a pussy, according to this guy.
Exactly. You're soft, real soft. Which, I mean, it does. There is a little bit of truth, in the idea of, the idea that our current culture has turned this way because we haven't had our World War II.
Good times create weak men, and
exactly.
Bad
So
times,
I think
bad times create strong men. Yeah.
So even though that truth is there, I think he brings it into falsity and uses it to obviously justify some horrible things. You can even use truths to an advantage for real evil things. But Hayek continues on by saying, quote, war is to Sombart the consummation of the heroic view of life. And the war against England is a war against the opposite ideal, the commercial ideal of individual freedom and of English comfort. English comfort made them weak. Ruling with an iron fist makes Germany strong. Thus lays the foundation of the tendency towards war in Germany, in German leadership at the time. But it's not war for war's sake. That is not the goal. War was a way to get socialism's foot in the door, planning's foot in the door, organization's foot in the door. They used the war economy to begin this experiment, as actually Plenge continues to quote here in 1916, quote, the war economy created in Germany in 1914 is the first realization of a socialist party and its spirit, the first active and not merely demanding appearance of the socialist spirit. He refers here to the war economy that put the German-Russian ideas of organization into practice, resulting in a real socialist society, right? He's parading that idea. This is why war is a good thing, because it builds this type of society through organization. The society tried to maintain some semblance of individual freedom for a while, but then had to abandon it because it became an obstacle to organization. Plenge continues his thoughts in 1918 by saying, quote, the organization of capital, which began unconsciously before the war and which during the war has been continued consciously, will be systematically continued after the war. They had all the plans in the world. 1918 here, nearing the end of the war, they were not going to lose this war completely. They may have lost it physically, but they were not going to lose the ideological battle that was associated with this war that was so important for them to maintain. The war economy organizes and concentrates power. Once power has been concentrated, it is almost impossible to diffuse. The only people left to oppose this concentration of power are the liberals, few and far between in Germany, and it's their liberalism and its influence that must be destroyed if the socialist trend is to continue. So, how do we stop it? It's really hard to stop this infectious idea when it's already taken hold. As Plenge continues to state, quote, socialism is coming and in fact has to some extent already arrived, since we can no longer live without it. It's a sentiment you said before. Plenge believes that the host has already been compromised by this infection. And even though I don't necessarily disagree with him, the infection has started. We do need to figure out a way to rid ourselves of infection. A note you just wrote down here, Social Security. That's something that just kicking the buck down the road is probably a bad idea. It's literally the embodiment of pushing off responsibility. But it's here now. Like, what do we say? What do we tell the old people? Like, okay, you paid into this your whole life, but we're going to end it now. Well, no, that's not a reasonable thing. So let's just, cut it off. Let's say, all right, the people who paid into it get this. The people who paid a little bit into it get a little bit out of it. But no, that's now taking this thing away from them. That's taking a meal off your plate and saying, well, this shouldn't have been there in the first place. It's not a good enough excuse to take it away. So it's something that has its foot in the door, something that's already been established, and to take it back away is always seen as, this privilege that's taken away from you is so difficult to pull back, which is the reason why it's so difficult for, I would say, the more conservatives who are against Social Security to fight it. But again, these same ideas, once collectivism has taken hold, once it's a known quantity and known concept, to pull it back out of the society and try to re-implement individualism is nearly impossible. And of course, Germany didn't even attempt to do that.
Yep. Yeah. And Social Security was what maybe where people say we can no longer live without it. It's like, well, we won't take this away from us seniors. It's like, actually, I can pretty much anyone who takes 5 seconds to think about it can realize that just because there are some people currently dependent on it doesn't mean we have to create future people dependent on it. And so you can get rid of it actually quite easily, but that's an unpopular thing to say. So so here's a quote from Professor Carr in Hayek's time in Great Britain, making the same arguments about war and stuff. He says, after all, this one is hardly surprised to find a characteristic section headed "The Moral Functions of War," in which Professor Carr condescendingly pities the well-meaning people, especially in English-speaking countries, who, steeped in 19th century tradition, that's this guy's favorite freaking word, right? Persist in regarding war as senseless and devoid of purpose, and rejoice in the sense of meaning and purpose of war, which Carr calls the most powerful instrument of social solidarity. So you have Professor Carr arguing for the solidarity created in war, and how like these naive idiots want to cling to this 19th century ideal that war doesn't have a purpose, or that war can't be used for the greater good. And of course, here Carr is talking about central planning, and let's bring everyone together and implement planning because the war economy works so well. I found an article, so we're going to map that onto today, called "The U.S. Economy in World War II as a Model for Coping with Climate Change." And I found a Vox article that says, quote, "The kind of stuff that FDR did in the run-up to the war is deeply offensive to longstanding conservative economic orthodoxy. It's big, activist, tax and spend government, intervening in the economy, directing industrial activity. That's what would be required for the kind of wartime mobilization McKibben, which I'll talk about him here in a minute, is talking about. Big, activist, tax and spend government." And so who's McKibben? So, and this Vox article, by the way, agreed with this idea of the U.S. modeling its economy after World War II to fight climate change. And here's the McKibben guy wrote this other thing. And that's what the Vox article is quoting, where McKibben says, "Long story short, what's required in wartime mobilization is an enormous amount of centralized federal executive authority, an enormous amount of borrowing and taxing, and an enormous amount of labor displacement and retaining." What's that mean by displacement? We're going to tell you where you can and can't work, right? That's what we talk about in the economy. Well, let us just take care of the economy. Oh, that means that we can tell you where to work and what you can and can't do, at least temporarily, right? The economy will be more government directed than market based, which means the government will control everything. I love that temporary. I think was it a Milton Friedman quote? There's nothing quite as temporary, or nothing quite as permanent as a temporary government program. I'm pretty sure it's Milton Friedman. So anyway, so we see this argument happening again today of using the war economy and like this analog of war. You know, I think again, war on drugs, war on COVID. There was this, I forgot what it's called, the Defense Something Act that Trump wouldn't invoke when COVID initially happened, but it was where he could commandeer industries and tell them what to do. Mm-hmm. And a big thing why they had all these press conferences with business leaders coming out, like the MyPillow guy and stuff, who was making masks, was he was like, I don't have to invoke this because businesses have already transitioned to making the COVID supplies that we need. But the left was hammering him about not taking control of private industries and telling them what to do. You know, how dare he, let them have autonomy. Anyway, so this argument, the point is the planners and this call for planning, if you're going to follow the progression, exists before the war. And so they'll either use a real war or a war metaphor to implement their stupid plan. And then that after the war, or if there is if they use a war metaphor, then it's ongoing, right? I mean, we still have who are the safety marshals in the air? What was the division for the something? Oh my gosh, was it DHS that was conveyed it or created after 9/11? One of them was there. We had a couple things created after 9/11.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, there's that still exists. They continue on. But if it's a real war, then they'll make arguments for it to continue. And lo and behold, that leads us to our third progression, which is, we need a society run by experts. So whether it's before the war or during the war is where they get to really put a lot of the stuff into practice. If you want to look at how planners in war, how well that goes, listen to the esoteric radio theater talk about Vietnam. I forgot that Bill Whittle does this great series on communism and the Cold War, but he has multiple episodes where he talks about Vietnam and how they had these genius planners in there to dictate how the war and the war strategy, and it's completely horrible and idiotic and ridiculous. But anyway, so then but that's what happens when you get a society run by experts, and Gandalf puts on the ring. But here's going to be, I guess, the specifics of that third component.
For sure. Yeah. So we've seen experts as a theme in a lot of chapters leading up to this. And this one, I like this one because it puts it in the context and in different contexts, obviously the German and the British, and then we've seen it a million times over. I bet we'll talk about COVID a little bit. So in chapter 12, which is going to go over the German context, he talks about Wilhelm Ostwald, which is a Nobel Prize winning German chemist. So of course he's going to speak on society and economics. Quote, while the other nations still live under the regime of individualism, we have already achieved that of organization. I forgot what year that was in, but I think that was early years of World War II, if I'm correct. So yeah, why, this here we have a chemist, again, expert on everything, and Nobel Prize winning chemist who's seen as an authority in all things because he won a nice award. And the funny comment or kind of analog I think I already put in here is like this, and the Nobel Prize winning chemist in early 20th century Germany is basically their version of a rock star or a Hollywood celebrity that has some weird respect for random things, George Clooney, but nevertheless a scientist advocating for a plan to organize society. Who should organize the society? Well, the experts, of course, right? And we see our experts as the first line of defense. And this is the way we try to view experts or scientists, engineers, all these people. We see them as the first line of defense against stupidity, tyranny, and unnecessary suffering. But unfortunately, they're almost always the first group of people to agree with and align with the authoritarians. As Hayek continues on to quote here, quote, the way in which, in the end, with few exceptions, where scholars and scientists put themselves readily at the service of the new rulers is one of the most depressing and shameful spectacles in the whole history of the rise of National Socialism. It is well known that particularly the scientists and engineers, who had so loudly claimed to be the leaders on the march to a new and better world, submitted more readily than almost any other class to the new tyranny. It's not only depressing and shameful that the experts so willingly to surrender their powers to support the course of society of the authoritarian regime, but we saw this happen to great effect in Nazi Germany. To quote again, the Nazis were able to coordinate scholars, scientists with relative ease, and hence to throw behind their elaborate propaganda the seemingly weight of the bulk of German learned opinion and support. This is a quote of an American economist, Robert A. Brady, an expert on Nazi socialism. There's a long list of famous Nazi scientists who did awful things. They had a very, very large science department. And I'm not sure, of course, not all scientists just signed up for this and were willing to stand by as the rights of the individual are taken away. But the majority who weren't,
Albert Einstein.
Exactly. But the majority who aren't going to line up are singled out by that loud minority. Is that not something what we see today? It's a call out culture, that cartel idea that if you are against the grain, if you decide to come out for it, all of a sudden you're just going to get shut down and you could lose your job and your profession. This is why it's a little pushback on the very obvious evils we see today. Think of something like transitioning kids that dare not a doctor speak out against that.
Affirm
they'll
only.
get slandered by Nature. They'll get slandered by Science Magazine. All these big guys will absolutely slander them in the science community. So this is already, to jump in the contemporary just a teeny bit, we see this happening today in real time. We already talked about it. There's no doubt that we see the experts lining up because they're singularly focused and they understand if they just get this little bit of temporary power, they can achieve their goals so much more quickly with all these additional resources. And this is how you get the experts that's lined up. And as Hayek put it brilliantly, it is depressing and shameful to see how quickly the experts were to jump in line, even though we kind of see them as the first defense against this type of tyranny.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think, man, there's somewhere later or somewhere in these chapters where he mentions that when he's talking about the scientists, where he says, there's a reason why most of the scientists that fled Germany were Jews. Obviously, there's a very good reason for that, but it's more interesting. He says the ones who came from Germany, I don't know if we got into this quote or not, but where they basically said, man, if it weren't for that one thing that Hitler did, and it was all about, like, if it weren't for that Holocaust thing, everything else was great. And I've referenced that Tugwell guy before, who was a advisor to FDR, who went over and just praised Mussolini's fascism heavily and how that was the ideal for us to strive for. And then that dude was helping influence FDR with the New Deal. I mean, it's like there is a straight line in a lot of ways between, again, when you introduce the power dynamic into the expert class or this credentialing mechanism, in a lot of ways, where, the only ideas that rise to the top are ones that advocate for more power to those experts, or for the application of that power. And Hayek, this is one of the things that, by the way, just as an aside, that I really liked about reading these chapters is you see Hayek saying and doing a lot of the same things that we do, where he's like they were saying this back then, guys, why aren't you paying attention? Like, here are these people who said this, or this quote where he talks about this person who seemed prophetic in their analysis of stuff. Like, Hayek is blown away by the fact that people were ignoring the past, and you can hear that in his writing there. And it's just, it kind of creates this bond, it feels like, where it's like we are reading his work saying the same thing today. And it's not like it doesn't feel good to be doing that, but it is an interesting.
Are you saying we should write a book so that the next generation, the next liberalism culture that comes out there, not China probably, but somewhere out there, is going to read our book and be like, these guys were saying it because this guy was saying it because these guys were saying it. Why aren't we doing it again? Yeah. The cycle continues.
Yeah. So, but here's this quote from Hayek again. He's talking about the in Great Britain, this push for putting the experts in charge. He says, the role which the intellectuals played in the totalitarian transformation of society. Let's just pause and read that again, by the way. The role in which the intellectuals played in the totalitarian transformation of society, sound familiar, people, again, was prophetically foreseen in another country by Julien Benda. Julien Benda was a French philosopher. And what Benda said was, quote, the superstition of science held to be competent in all domains, including that of morality, a superstition which, I repeat, is an acquisition of the 19th century. It remains to discover whether those who brandish this doctrine believe in it, or whether they simply want to give the prestige of a scientific appearance to passions of their hearts. So again, they'll use scientific arguments to justify whatever dumbass thing they feel strongly about. Or maybe a very good thing, by the way. It doesn't have to be stupid, but the applications are stupid, which they perfectly know are nothing but passions. It is to be noted that the dogma that history is obedient to scientific laws is preached especially by partisans of arbitrary authority, end quote. And so Hayek is saying the experts are a lot of the people who legitimize the use and the acquisition of massive amounts of power and authority for the government, because they'll be at the top of that hierarchy. And a lot of times, they're idealists, they're naive, they think it'll work this time because they're so smart. It's that hubris. It's Dr. Ian Malcolm, it's just no humility whatsoever. And so that's what Hayek was seeing in his time, was people were just like, look, put the experts in charge. Like the science can run everything. That's what was happening in Science magazine at the time also. But for a modern day example of like why experts are so amazing, I found this article called "Anti-Intellectualism Poses a Fundamental." This is a scholarly article, by the way. Anti-intellectualism poses a fundamental challenge in maintaining and increasing public compliance with expert-guided COVID-19 health directives, because they've always been so consistent, right? There's been no errors that have been made. No one's changed their position on anything. Nothing's been conflicting in the information. You know,
Twitter
the WHO
stance.
and the CDC and every other country in the world have all literally been in lockstep this whole time. So how dare anyone challenge any of it?
Misinformation.
Right. And I found a Washington Post article titled "The Spread of COVID-19 in the South Shows the Risk of Anti-Intellectualism. Skepticism about science and expertise has long permeated the Bible Belt." By the way, the thrust of that insane article went all the way back to like the Scopes monkey trial and how the South loved racism and hated science and how they wanted to maintain segregation and racism. And then they drew a straight line from that to people in the South catching COVID and dying of COVID and being skeptical of mandates. Like, this was a batshit article. It was absolutely crazy. But we see this today where it's trust the science, trust the experts, and they'll bring out certain people, but then they'll silence other people. So like that, you know, the Zelenko guy who came up with the Zelenko protocol with hydroxychloroquine and zinc and Z-Pak. And I think they've added something else to it since. They added, I think they're using cortisol steroids. It's like, we can't allow any competing expertise. That goes into the role of propaganda from chapter 11. You can't have alternative, like opinions even. I'm not saying alternative facts, just alternative opinions to be there, so that all that's available is our experts that will trot out to talk about stuff. Like, why is that Leanne Wen chick who, I mean, is just parroting CCP talking points out on CNN and all these networks? She's the expert they go to say like why we should have mandates and why we should take away people's freedoms and stuff. It's like, they'll never get a scientist. In fact, they've removed YouTube videos of doctors getting out there and saying, hey, this is what I've done and it works. There's a dude, I can't remember what his name is, but I think he's the guy who invented mRNA vaccine technology, who gave a testimony to the Senate talking about the effectiveness of cortisol steroids in treating COVID symptoms. And YouTube removed that video of him talking to the Senate. Like, it's crazy. So anyway, it's not just about like putting the experts in charge, but it's about putting our experts in charge, putting the people who agree with us in charge, and trusting the science, and just shitting on anyone who, you know, would possibly have a different opinion, including other experts.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking up real quick if Leanne Wen, for some reason I thought she was the one who was the temporary head of Planned Parenthood. I think I'm thinking of someone else, but they're bringing on someone else who's like the head, or was the head of Planned Parenthood, as the medical expert in there, and that goes to show you how you meld experts. I mean, even we're using expert very, very loosely when it comes to that, I suppose, but yeah, it just goes to show how we're willing to cross paths with people as long as they agree in the right direction, but we're completely unwilling to actually talk with an expert in that field. And I'm not talking about, you know, Dr. Fauci, who hasn't actually practiced medicine in like 50 years or something like that, like hasn't seen a patient in like 50 years or something like that, and utilize those people, those real politicians, not scientists, not real experts, and bring them out, because we're assured that they will say the right things. And once they don't say the right thing, well, then they're out. Then the next expert coming. It's weird how it seems like CNN, MSNBC just like has a line of experts, just it's like down the street, like it's some opening of the new iPhone or something like that, and they're just like lined up just waiting for their turn. And once this expert says something uninteresting or slightly in the wrong direction, that guy goes out, next expert comes in, you know, expert of whatever, gender studies, talking about, you know, COVID-19 stuff. So it's frustrating. I mean, you look at CNN, you look at MSNBC, you mean even Fox News, you see experts all day. If you watch those shows, experts all day. And it's not the kind of experts, you know, we want to listen to on the subjects they're talking about.
Not even a little bit. Yeah. So anyway, so that's to recap just that progression of, you know, of things. We'll end up having, you'll see a change in rhetoric, a change in attitudes, a change in emotions. And then that leads to like, okay, well, what do we do with that? Right. And oftentimes the people facilitating that change are these experts or these, intellectuals who have this plan in mind, and that kind of fomenting of change, or I think Hayek used the word agitating, is intentional to remove any obstacles of putting their plan into place. And so they'll use a wartime metaphor or economy to put their plan into place. And then, of course, lo and behold, part of their argument is that experts should be in charge of society. And wouldn't you just know it, that they're going to be the ones, like, no person who makes these arguments, I think you hinted at this earlier, no person who makes these arguments doesn't see themselves as part of that power structure that they're arguing for the creation of, right? Like, not a single one of them sees themselves outside the top of the power structure that they're arguing for. That should raise huge alarms in your mind. But that Hayek is saying, hey, Great Britain, look at what happened in Germany 20, 30 years ago. Here's the arguments. You're making them word for word and emotion for emotion here today. And then you and I are now saying, like, yeah, hey, look, America, you're making the same arguments that Hayek saw in his day and that Germany made a few decades prior. And they all lead to authoritarianism. They all lead to totalitarian takeover and the loss of our freedoms and liberties.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have the conclusion written out here. I don't know if you want to take us.
I just added this part, and then you can take whatever the next part is. But I thought that this is worth getting into in our conclusion. And then we can at the end talk about the part that we left out, that we censored. So I think the first conclusion, this is something I just thought of, because this is something we had originally had put in here from our original review of these chapters. But I think one of the big takeaways is that these ideas need to be taken seriously. Now, we haven't really mentioned anything about that in this conversation, but I think that should be a big conclusion, because so I've gotten into before, like, talked about the Lindy effect and what Lindy is. And Lindy describes the durability of things that are inorganic, and they have an inverse relationship with aging. Like, the older something is, the longer, that's a really good predictor of how long you'll expect to see it in the future. And the younger something is, then that's, raises a lot more question marks about how durable it is. So in other words, if something is Lindy, and again, these are inorganic things. It could be an idea. It could be a piece of technology, like simple machines, like the wheel, right? Like, we're probably not going to have a future where the wheel isn't being used. It's been around for so long, that'd be an asinine prediction. But the same exists for ideas. And these ideas are Lindy. They've been around a long time. Crazy ideas have been around for a long time. And I think because these ideas have been around for so long and people have been making these arguments for so long, we need to take them seriously, because they will be around in the future. And so we need to, one, inoculate ourselves to them, and also help others to inoculate themselves, so that every time they spring up, I mean, that's that Reagan quote about how liberty is always just one generation away, or the loss of liberty or whatever is always just one generation away. And so, like, we have to have a strong inoculation against these ideas. And you do that by taking it seriously. I think one of the things we had in that initial introduction also was, like, the facts don't care about your feelings crowd. Like, the people on the right who just want to say that's a stupid idea and not engage in it are making a huge error. They're actually going against the John Stuart Mill thing. John Stuart Mill said, he who knows only his side of an argument knows little of it, because they can't make an argument to the contrary. You need to be able to play devil's advocate. And you only do that when you take ideas seriously. And so I want to give two quotes here, and then Kevin, you can pick up whichever the next part. But this is from the beginning of chapter 12. It's where he says, it is a common mistake to regard National Socialism as a mere revolt against reason, an irrational movement that without intellectual background. If that were so, the movement would be much less dangerous than it is. So he's saying, if this was just pure stupidity and there was no logic behind it, then it wouldn't be dangerous. But it's because it has ideas that need to be taken seriously that make it so dangerous. Hayek says, nothing could be further from the truth or more misleading. The doctrines of National Socialism are the culmination of a long evolution of thought, a process in which thinkers who have had great influence far beyond the confines of Germany have taken part. Their system was developed with ruthless consistency. Once one accepts the premises from which it starts, there is no escape from its logic. It is simply collectivism freed from all traces of an individualist tradition, which might hamper its realization. So Hayek is saying these have to be taken seriously. Like, this is a long line of thought, and it's not just confined to Germany. And this is the same thing. I think that we have to take seriously, like Marcuse's long march through the institutions, the way they took over academia and all this other stuff. Like, this is serious stuff, and we need to know how to engage it intellectually. And what it made me think of is this quote from Michael Malice's The New Right, where he says, "The fringe is where both innovation and insanity lay. Sometimes innovation seems like insanity because one hasn't encountered such concepts before and can't quite port them to one's own frame of reference. And sometimes they're just genuinely batshit. Cranks are a byproduct of free thought and a consequence of liberation from orthodoxy. In other words, it takes work to determine whether an idea, whether to determine if an ideology is insane or innovative or a mixture of both. In other words, even if," and he says, "the new right's solutions were all incorrect, that wouldn't mean their criticisms were inaccurate as well." And what we can say here is that even if the socialists or the planners or these people during our time who are making these arguments, even if their solutions are inaccurate, which I think they are not accurate, I think we agree on that, that doesn't mean their criticisms are inaccurate as well. And so that's part of taking these ideas seriously. There's a reason why those ideas were able to gain ascendancy in Germany and in Great Britain and here today. It's because they're tapping into things that are real. And so we have to know how to not just understand the ideas, but also map on alternative ideas and solutions and principles to them whenever they take place. So when someone argues for a wartime economy, or when someone argues for some central planning or organization or putting these experts in charge, you need to be able to engage that seriously and not just say, well, this guy's an idiot, or facts don't care about your feelings, and expect that to be good enough, because it's not good enough.
Yeah. I mean, the way you have to handle bad ideas, good ideas, doesn't matter. You have to take them as valid to start out with, and then you have to try to tease your way through them. You know, the idea of steel manning, I think, is a really, really good practice for this kind of stuff, even though it's really hard. You feel disgusting if you try to steel man a Nazi position, right? It's not a good feeling to try to really step in their shoes, but sometimes that's important. This is the reason why people still read, Hitler's book, and Mein Kampf, there we go, that's the name, and try to understand. This is the reason I have Das Kapital, 3 volumes of it right behind me, is because I love pain, and I want to know more about the ideology, the basis for a lot of the things that are happening today, why people have these ideas. Because so often, like the quote we've cited before, they're so disconnected to its origin that people don't even understand its origin. They don't understand that the talking points they're giving right now is grounded in some, Marxian ideology that they might reject, but this is an ideology connected with, 100 million plus deaths in the 20th century. And it's something you have to take seriously, even if it's evil. And, like the notes you put here, Hayek does such a good job in 1944, mind you. This is nearing the end of World War II. And the horrible atrocity that was caused by Nazism, by not directing and not focusing the socialist threat just in Nazism, but by looking at what led up to that point, the authoritarianism that led up to that point. And he I think really what you paraphrase here is that the loss of freedom is the inevitable result of socialism, and Nazism is just one particular species of that authoritarianism. And so Hayek set about a lot of this book warning people about the threat of socialism and looking at the attitudes we listed out today, along with all the other context in the book and these arguments and policies that gained ascendancy in Germany decades prior to Nazism. This is not, again, just about World War II, Hitler. These are the buzzwords, the names that we know, that we associate to evil, but we don't know Sombart, we don't know Plenge, we don't know E.H. Carr, we don't know Waddington. There's all these different names that really shored up the foundation of this ideology that we just ignore, and we just look at the totalitarians, that they get the evil people who got on top. We look at them and we blame them. We don't blame the system that got them on top, the inevitable system that got them on top. And that's extremely important. Then you made the analogy here about, going into the doctor, and the doctor doesn't base his, analysis on what you're doing in that moment in the office, but by your recent past activities, diet and what you're putting in your body, your exercise, your sleep, all these different things to get a good picture of what past tense caused that malady that you're experiencing in the present. This kind of diagnosis Hayek is doing in this book. He's trying to diagnose, he's looking at the symptoms, he's looking at the problems we see in this society today and saying, all right, what did you do? What did you eat this morning? What did you eat last week? Have you been exercising? How have you been sleeping? How have you been doing? What kind of vitamins are you taking? All these different poking and prodding ideas and questions that should figure out what has this society been ingesting that has resulted in these horrible side effects, these horrible symptoms. So he's really telling someone who just took up smoking to look at the lung charts of someone who's been smoking for 30 plus years to show them this is what happens when you start doing this. Okay. Go down that road. Okay. You can go down that road and test it out, but you understand the road. You're peeling off the road to liberalism. You're peeling off the road to prosperity, and instead you're going onto the on-ramp to the road to serfdom and the road to servitude. We've seen it happen before. We can quantify the ideas that you're going for by seeing what's happened before, the many times it's been tried. Believe me, it's been tried, and actually seeing its real-time results, because they're trying to separate again that moral basis from the moral results, thinking that this moral basis is good enough and it will eventually lead to moral results after, again, 100 million plus bodies are left along the way to utopia.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what Hayek, the other thing he's doing here is he's taking it seriously. That's why he wrote this book, right? Like, he's taking these ideas seriously. And the thing about, with the smoking analogy is, like, it doesn't matter if you switch, just like it doesn't matter what form of collectivism you use. It doesn't matter what brand of cigarettes you smoke, right? Like, you could take the lung scans of a chronic smoker who these are Marlboro, these are Pall Mall, these are Winston's or whatever. I don't even remember what, whatever they are, Newports, and they're all going to have the same lung scans. Right. And so it's like, well, socialism, democratic socialism, Marxism, or whatever, communism, it's all going to lead to the same thing. Right. That road to serfdom, like you said there. And we see, Democrat, socialist today. I mean, again, I remember my dad multiple times back whenever I used to say that democratic socialism was different because I didn't know anything. But even today, I remember, like, whenever I finished this book, I called him immediately because I forgot that he advocated for all this bullshit. And because I knew that he was alive, during a lot of, like, the Red Scare stuff. And at least at the end, he was drafted in Vietnam. My dad's pretty old. And so I wanted to pick his brain on it. And then I'd forgotten, and he made the argument then. I remember it's clear as day, and he still says it. He's like, no, it's democratic socialism. It's like, no, it's a turd sandwich. It's a sandwich. Don't worry about the turd part.
Got bread on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there is one thing that we left out that we want to address, and that is the end of chapter 13 has this chunk in it about monopolies and the way that the government and those monopolies are run by experts and stuff. And so it does have a little bit of overlap. But it's a lot of it is about the marrying of government, like, with monopoly and the facility and the inevitability of monopolies and how they're actually a good thing. And whenever we were listening to it, we were like, this is tech, like, this is big tech stuff today. And I'm sure we'll go back through it and come up with some other stuff as well that it relates to, because that's what tends to happen every time. The more you go over it, the more you think of new things that it goes with. But so we're either going to put that in our next video and see if it connects to chapter 14, or we'll put it in our conclusion, right? Because, part of this discussion that we did was, it was like, okay, here's all these ideas, and then the policies that Germany, you put into place. How'd that work out for them? Well, we know how that worked out for them, right? And in Great Britain, Hayek was arguing, hey, don't do this. And I touched a little bit on how that worked out for them. They had conservatives for a while. They got rid of Neville Chamberlain and had conservatives for a while. And then they brought in labor, and literally the guy in 64 was arguing for centralized planning, like economic planning. Like, it's crazy reading what this dude, who is an actual socialist, who got elected in Great Britain in 1964. I can't remember what his name is. It started with a W, Wilson, maybe. And he was arguing for economic planning, and then they tried it for 15 years and it didn't work out so hot, and anyway, we can, in Great Britain today, even under someone like Boris Johnson, isn't doing very well. I mean, just because Great Britain's version of a conservative is like, it's our version. It's like our Joe Biden, honestly, in a lot of ways. Like, it's an old school Democrat, it's not,
I was going to say Elizabeth Warren, but
yeah, I mean, no, really, but
Americans over there.
Great Britain does not have a political class that's on par with someone like Rand Paul. They don't have, they're not that I'm aware of. There might be, but I don't think they have any
someone
power.
like Ted Cruz. I would moderate that more to
even someone like Ted Cruz. No, you're totally right. Yeah, not that I'm aware of. Maybe they do, I'm sure they have something similar, but I don't think they have any institutional power, is my point. So it's not going so hot for Great Britain. And America, we can look at the rise of this bureaucratic state. I really want to study the rise of the bureaucratic state. I know that there's a lot of books out there on it, but we can see how it's going for us here today with our spending and with like the increase in concentration of power at the top of the government. Anyway, so that's a whole nother thing. The point is that chapter, that part of chapter 13 that relates a lot to tech and monopolies, we'll either include in the next one or in our total final summary and conclusions of the book, because what we want, we hit on it here a little bit in terms of the modern analogs, because we just think it's relevant. We want to try to do that and make this more and more relevant to our contemporary time, contemporary listeners. But the final discussion is going to be largely the contemporary application of this stuff. And so if it doesn't fit with the next one, then we'll do it at the end.
Sure. Yeah. I think we did well on this one. Felt good. Looks good. So we'll listen to it back, and you guys obviously can leave your comments if all this work. What do we have to put on at least 10 plus hours, like on Zoom, not even like by ourselves. I'm talking about like
more
face-to-face time.
Way
yeah,
more.
I think more than that.
I bet you it's closer to 20. If you think about how much time we worked on it when I was in Montana, dude.
Yeah. I don't want to make it all about us, but if you're not subscribing to any of our locals communities, I don't know what you're doing. Anyways, we have 2 more chapters after this, so 14, 15, then we have a conclusion. Obviously we read through 14, 15, see if we can combine them or whatever process we're going to take during that, but we're nearing the end, which is kind of exciting, kind of a bummer, because I do like doing these. I do like revisiting this material constantly, but the good thing is I think there are more books out there. That's true. I'm not sure. So, there's always going to be a good one next. So again, any of you guys listening to this, make your suggestions as to what you would find interesting that might be more relatable to this material. That maybe a book that people just aren't looking at, because this book is so underutilized. It's insane. So, man, just let us know. And we enjoy doing this stuff. So thanks for listening.
And then whenever I hear someone like Yarvin say, skip Hayek and read Mises, because Mises just like concentrated, like better version of Hayek, I'm like, how is that a thing? Like, how is there a better? I was looking into stuff by Mises. I'm like, I've got to, like, I mean, that claim is so audacious that it's like, I have to at least investigate it, because Yarvin's right about the Machiavellians. So I think the third economics book that I got was Mises's book on socialism, but I don't think I've dived into it because it's a textbook. It's dude, that guy was, I mean, there's a reason why there's a whole chapter of the Libertarian Party named after him. That's a Mises caucus that Carlin advocates for. And it sounds like I think they're actually pretty solid. Is there anything else that you think, like, do you feel like we did a good enough summary there, that anything you'd add to our just general summary of the conversation of the chapters?
No, I think a lot of this is just tracking that trajectory is a big one. You have to map those kinds of trajectories to understand where they started, where they're coming from. Obviously, there's differences between pre-World War I Germany and the origins of liberalism in Britain. There's obviously a difference between Germany and Britain's origins compared to America's origins. Those are a bit different. There are different people involved, but that does not mean that bad ideas can't grab hold. And I think we did a decent job of highlighting the bad ideas that got hold in Germany, got hold in Britain, and got hold in America. And so don't think that just being American is a defense to this stuff, or it's not something you have to take seriously. Take it seriously. If you don't understand this well enough, one, just by listening to us, read the book, of course. There's plenty of resources on this type of investigation and trajectory mapping. But I hope we did a decent enough job at it today to give everyone a good idea as to what it looked like in Germany, what it looked like in Britain, and what it looks like today in America.
Yep. I think that's a good place to leave it. Everyone, thank you for watching. Again, if this kind of thing you're into, please like, share, and subscribe. Share this with people, tell them about it. Again, like Kevin said, just suggest the book to them. That'd probably be simpler than watching our stuff, although I still would recommend that. As for Kevin, please follow him on YouTube, Engineering Politics. On Locals, it's engineeringpolitics.locals.com. And then on Twitter, it's ENG_politics, which again, criminally undersubbed, criminally underfollowed. So please follow him. And then he has written content on Medium. Carlin told me that I need to do Substack instead of Medium. I don't know if there's a big difference. I think you can get more money.
I'm technically on Substack. I don't really, earning money is not something in the front of my mind right now, but Medium certainly promotes a lot of stuff that's very woke and left leaning. Yeah. So that's my only, I've never had an issue with them, and I don't want to say anything bad about them, but that is, at the top of the list.
And ThinkSpot as well. You can find.
Oh yeah.
ThinkSpot. They've been great about promoting this stuff. So definitely give a shout out.
Also make sure to give Truman a follow at returntoreason.locals.com, at My Mundane Mind on Twitter, and Return to Reason on YouTube, on ThinkSpot as well. And you have some written stuff on Medium as well, and maybe in Substack soon.
Yeah, we'll see. So, all right. Thanks for watching, everyone. And we will check you next time.
Peace.